Anyway, I want to cut straight into our first presenter. He's actually joining us from near the Arctic Circle. John Linnell is actually born and raised in Ballydehob in County Cork, which was a bit of a shock to me. When I first met him, I was looking forward to meeting this really exotic, sort of a Scandinavian, and he turned out to be from Ballydehob. And then in a bizarre, very bizarre twist of fate, the house that my family go to on holidays is the house that John grew up in. So that is just, that just wrecks my head every time I think about that. Anyway, John came over to one of our mammal symposiums, I can't remember how many years ago it was, and we've become firm friends ever since. And it's great to have him. And as soon as I sort of suggested that he might give us a talk today, he accepted with alacrity. He'd hoped to be here, but wasn't able to make it. He's coming over for Easter, so he's just a little bit late. But he is joining us today. I believe he is online. John has worked. He got out of Ballydehob quite quick, it has to be said, but did do his undergrad in UCC, and has now worked all over the world. And his specialization, anyone who follows him on a ResearchGate or any of those fora will know that he's an absolute international expert on wildlife conflict. And he's worked on tigers and lynx and bears and wolves. He's done a lot of significant reports for the EU Commission. And see if I can flatter him now to the point that he blushes. Keep going, he says. Keep going. He was very good to come over a couple of years ago and help us with our pine marten situation in Ireland, which is it's a genuine issue. It's why we're here. The pine marten is recovering, and that is leading to all sorts of interesting scenarios. But happily, we're not alone. And John has dealt with similar scenarios with tigers in villages in India and with lynx and wolves and bears, as I said. So we're really delighted that he's able to join us today and give us an introduction sort of to the wider global context of human-wildlife conflicts. So over to you, John.
Thank you, Ferdia. Thank you. You're always great to get my ego going. So perhaps I should actually can record this or something so I can play it back. If I'm having a bad day, I can just play back one of Ferdia's introductions, and suddenly I might start feeling good about myself again. Because like if you work on conflicts, it's kind of depressing sometimes. So occasionally you do need a little sort of a pick-me-up. Anyway, guys, I just hope the sound's okay and the right pictures are up on the screen there, and that you're not watching my internet surfing instead of my PowerPoint. That might be slightly embarrassing. So, like Ferdia said, I kind of grew up in Ballydehob, the edge of the ocean, the edge of the world, and I kind of watched a little bit, kind of too much TV in my childhood, kind of too much David Attenborough, too much, Jacques Cousteau and To the Waters and the Wild and other such gems. And I guess I had a certain kind of wanderlust growing up out there. And well, in my whole kind of professional life, I've actually been able to satisfy that kind of wanderlust. Kind of working with nature and wildlife. And kind of carnivores were sort of actually a part of my childhood in a way, that kind of we had kind of tame foxes who would come in the garden and stuff. But back then, I never kind of dreamt that they would actually be my job. That seemed like a totally unknown dream, but they were part of my life. And like in Ballydehob, you have seals, you have otters, you have the odd stoat and badgers and things. So they were kind of sitting there in my consciousness growing up. Then in my kind of early professional life, I took a little detour and began working on Bambi. Like kind of Bambi's cute, right? So who cannot kind of resist spending time on Bambi? I guess my early career was very much like a prey, herbivore-centered way of looking at the world. But then from around 1995 onwards, I got kind of thrown into the deep end of kind of working with the top of the food chain. And then sort of Bambi got kind of relegated from being a fascinating little thing to study for its own sake to just being prey, right? So it took a while to think that little cute Bambi, his main purpose in life was actually just to get eaten by bigger animals. But well, that's how it works. That's ecology. That's the food chain. And since then, I've had the pleasure of working on an awful lot of these kind of big animals sitting on top of the food chain. It's kind of, people often ask why, like why work in carnivores and stuff. And well, I guess at the start, it was simply carnivores are cool, right? And you're young and you're kind of ambitious and got lots of testosterone and stuff, and you look for excitement. And carnivores certainly provide that excitement. Now they're cool, there's a certain glamour in them, and maybe a little bit of machismo, I guess, even though I'm not really known for being macho. But I guess as I've grown older, my sort of interest in carnivores has kind of modified a bit. And now that, as well as kind of being cool, I just find them actually, sorry, oops, I find them to be actually fascinating. And not only because of their own ecology, but because they're fascinating insights into the relationship between humans and nature. Because there's nowhere that you can study carnivores or work on them in a way that's isolated or removed from the human context. And that this relationship between us and them, it really does contain an incredible insight, because nobody is kind of indifferent to wolves and bears and tigers. Everybody has an opinion. Now, if you start, say, walking around West Cork asking people what they think about stoats, they look at you like you're mad, or what you think about, you know, a mushroom, or California's kind of favorite natterjack toad. They say, what, you know? But you ask people about tigers and bears, and everybody has an opinion on it. So kind of carnivores are cool, but they also offer this kind of fascinating side, right, into this kind of relationship. And it's not only the relationship between people and carnivores that's actually quite kind of fascinating, but it's actually the relationship between people and people who maybe have different opinions or different views or perspectives or values around carnivores. And I guess that part of my kind of maturing process as a scientist has been to really take more and more of an interest in people. And people are also kind of cool and interesting and fascinating at times, as well as being kind of frustrating and everything else. Especially when you start working in different places and you start bumping into different people coming from different cultures and different interests and different perspectives in different countries. And you really kind of realize that the diversity of cultural and social values and situations out there is absolutely quite amazing. And how these people can relate to carnivores especially is incredibly kind of diverse. So I guess that's kind of pretty much where I'm kind of drifting more and more into this kind of human side of things, because it offers an awful lot of excitement. So if we're exploring a bit of our kind of relationship with kind of carnivores, it's been through many transitions. So I guess like in our deep past, we had a highly complicated kind of relationship. Like it's no doubt that early humans kind of were prey, right? Like kind of humans are pretty wimpy species. You know, we got no fur, we got no weapons, we don't have any claws, we haven't got any teeth, we're pretty slow, we don't climb trees that well. So it's amazing that we actually survived at all throughout kind of evolution before we invented Gore-Tex and the internet. But somehow we did. But certainly some of us ended up in the stomachs of carnivores. But as well as being kind of prey to them and kind of competing with them, we also kind of respected them and worshipped them. Like these kind of cave paintings come from southern France, and they're like 35,000 years old. And we didn't kind of paint pictures of oak trees or pictures of jellyfish on the wall, or even of natterjack toads, but we actually painted pictures of big mammals, including large carnivores. And like you have a whole complicated like history of bear sacrifices and all sorts of things. So certainly our deeper past was a very ambivalent combination of kind of fear and respect and worship. Moving into more recent past, our history with carnivores was certainly not very good, right? Like talking about the last 2, 3, 4 centuries or more. And like we had these kind of policies of deliberate extermination. We had unregulated exploitation, like we're trapping them, didn't care about the future. Sometimes they were simply secondary victims of things like habitat change and deforestation, or else we're simply indifferent to them. But the result of all this was certainly that the recent history has been a period of dramatic decline, extirpation, and local or even sometimes global extinctions. So that kind of more complicated deep past relationship was certainly replaced by a fairly unified kind of negativity in recent centuries. Just to kind of illustrate this, Norway introduced a state bounty in 1846 by bringing in a law which kind of translates on law on the extermination of carnivores and the protection of us again. So this was like a very clear policy goal exterminate them. And they put like a policy mechanism in place by having a bounty that paid you a fairly significant sum to actually get out there and try and kill the last wolf, last bear, last lynx and wolverine, and pretty much everything else. Like they even actually had like stoats in there. They had all the raptors on that list. At one stage, they even had the bullfinch on the list because that was viewed as being a pest. So it was pretty extensive. And these bounties stayed in place, like kind of for wolves up until 1969. So there was like a century and a half there almost of very clear policy to exterminate. And if you, it even like build up like a cultural identity around it, like the paintings there, you know, the second from the left, you know, the bear hunter there, you know, it's like a hero. It's like a national romantic image of the farmer with a dead bear. So this was like a good thing. This was the idea at the time was actually to become a modern country. And kind of modernity back then meant getting rid of these big, pesky, troublesome, large carnivores to create this beautiful world of only kind of useful prey animals when the useless predators were all gone. So certainly that was a very much a conscious policy at the time. These trends just kind of show the numbers of carnivores killed in Norway from 1846 and onwards. And it really shows that in those early years, you know, the public kind of response to a bounty to kill these things was enormous. You know, people went out there with everything they had, you know, poison, traps, guns. And in about maybe 30, 40 years, 50 years, they had pretty much got rid of wolves and bears. Wolves were totally gone by the 1950s and 60s. The bears were down to a handful of individuals. And even like lynx and wolverines were hammered down to fairly low levels until suddenly everything changed. And like around 1970, 1972, suddenly species that kind of like wolves went from having a bounty on their heads to being totally protected overnight. It was a total 180-degree change in policy towards kind of these species, all around the late 60s, early 70s, 80s in some cases. And it's going to correspond to a global shift at a time. Like I'm too young to remember how it was in the 60s and the early 70s, but it must have been an incredible time for these total turnaround of kind of policies to kick in. Because like at the time we had all these international laws and regulations and conventions kind of coming in, like 1971, 72, 73, you know, it was an incredible period of formalizing a will to move from defining progress as exterminating a biodiversity and predators to defining progress and modernity as actually conserving them. So this happened in the period of 10 years, the world basically changed kind of direction totally. In Europe, like the first expression of this was the Bern Convention, which kind of kicked in 1979, now covering kind of 47 countries or 46, I guess, today. And then that got kind of incorporated into the EU legislation in 92 to form the Habitats kind of directive. But essentially, it's the same piece of legislation with the same ideas behind it. So this led to this era of kind of conservation motivation, right? Where we're trying to actually not only take care of what we have left, but actually put the animals back again. So after spending hundreds of years to get rid of them, now the effort was to get them back out there again. But we have to kind of remember that for most people today who are probably over 60, their childhood and their formative years grew up in a period when the values and the practices was to exterminate. And now they're kind of approaching kind of retirement in a period when that would put you in jail, and the good thing is to put them back. So it's within the present kind of generation that we've had this total change around of values. I think that's quite an important thing to bear in mind, is this how recent this kind of policy turnaround has been. So where has this kind of brought us? What is our status today? And this paper, I think it's around 2015 or 16 in Science, got a huge amount of attention. Like, I know it's small print, it's not kind of really important, but it's just to say that this was like an attempt to provide a review of what is the status of the world's largest carnivores. And the paper is good in many ways, but also it's highly problematic in other ways. That sort of, they have a column there on this table which has the like the IUCN status of different species, And it really reads like a litany of disaster, decreasing, 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 decreasing. And these species only occupy a very small part of what they occupied before people came along. And the whole text of the paper is very much about saying the world is going to hell in a handbasket. It's really trying to give a very negative spin on the situation, and then like a call for arms to bring back everything again. And there's a certain point in what these guys are spinning, but I also find it highly problematic. Like, for example, I also things have changed. Like, for example, on this list here, panda, for example, right, are listed up there as being, endangered and decreasing. But if we look at the kind of 2016 status of panda, well, actually, they've been downlisted from endangered to only the vulnerable, and it's viewed as being increasing. And then you think, well, pandas never occupy wide spaces, right? They were doing really badly, but there's probably never been a period since the Ice Age when pandas did well. You never had pandas running around West Cork, or Russia or India or Africa. They've always been a highly localized species. So there's probably never been a period in time when they wouldn't have had some threat status, because they simply naturally have a small distribution. And at the moment, they're doing well. Snow leopards are also an example that you can't pick up a publication on snow leopards when they don't talk about, decline and endangerment and they're almost gone. But actually, snow leopards today, they've also been downlisted from endangered to vulnerable, and they still occur pretty much throughout the whole range. And snow leopards, again, have never had a very wide kind of distribution. Again, they were never ranging across, Europe and Africa and stuff. They've always been confined to the Himalayas and kind of Mongolia and stuff. So again, you have to think, well, actually, are they doing so badly? And I then look at, say jaguars, they're not even on a threat status. They're near threatened. So even though they might be decreasing in some places, they have not actually entered a threat list. So actually, in other words, they're actually doing pretty well. And polar bears, like the icon of climate change and the vulnerability, and like all these pictures of the snow or the polar bear standing on a little iceberg that's melting. Well, actually, they're only actually vulnerable, and we don't even know what their trend is. It doesn't mean that it's doing well, but there's no dramatic evidence yet that they are currently kind of declining. Even though, like, sure, in a long-term perspective, it doesn't look very good. But just the point is now, they seem to be holding on somehow. So I think the nuance here is much more important than these kind of review papers with a very tabloid spin. And I think certainly a very value-laden spin create the impression. Another sort of example here would be the mountain lion or Puma. And they're put down as kind of decreasing. And everything, oh my God, it's going to hell. But you look at the threat status, it's actually least concern. So they aren't even near threatened. They're just actually least concerned. They are not of conservation importance because they're doing well. And the map there shows their current distribution. And like, sure, they lost the eastern part of North America, but otherwise in South America and the whole western part of Central and North America, they're still out there pretty much everywhere. And if you look at the current papers being kind of published, like these are just kind of some titles. It's about cougars recolonizing, it's about range expansion, it's about dispersal, recolonizing, natural recolonization. Even in South America, they're talking about, the appearance in suburban areas in Brazil. So when you look at the nuances, you find things actually are improving in many places. So certainly this global kind of presentation of doom and gloom, I think, is really a disservice to conservation, because it just makes us all get kind of depressed. And in many ways, I almost view it as being kind of dodgy science, because it's really overgeneralizing and trying to create a uniform impression for what is a very diverse and nuanced thing going on, with many, many local trends going in the opposite kind of direction. And that's kind of what I'm going to move into now, is a different example. But just to kind of sum up, the global situation is highly variable. Some species and populations are in real danger, but many are increasing. And we also have to bear in mind that these species are naturally rare, right? That kind of many species of kind of large carnivore will probably always have some type of threat status if you look at distribution and population size, because they probably never have had really, really big populations. And for some of them, at least, who are quite specialized, they probably never have had very, very wide-ranging distributions. So I think we have to be a little careful what we expect to even be the benchmark as to what we should hope they should become. So zooming in to what I think is the exceptions here against this kind of global trend or doom and gloom is kind of the story of large predators in Europe. And this is the kind of thing where an awful lot of, say, kind of North Americans and Asians, Africans really get shocked, because they had the impression that kind of Europe is just this land of asphalt and tulip fields and potato fields without any space for wildlife at all. And you say, yeah, sure, there is an awful lot of asphalt and a lot of people and a lot of fields, but that doesn't exclude actually having quite a lot of animals here and even having an awful lot of large predators. So, for example, if we look at wolves, and the next kind of 3 maps will be comparing 2 situations. They'll be kind of comparing like the 1950s, which is kind of the low point for many kind of European carnivores. And the map on the right is showing the status in like 2013, 2016, which is the most recent kind of continental-wide overview that we have. And the main point is that wolves have spread dramatically. Like if you look at the 1950 map, totally gone from Scandinavia, totally gone from France, Germany, the Low Countries, Central Europe, just clinging on the edges. And today they really are back everywhere. The only thing we've lost is the wolves in the very south of Spain. That's like the only population extinction we've had. Otherwise, these animals have spread. And you're getting some incredible kind of reconnections now, that kind of wolves from kind of southern Italy are now spreading into the Alps, and they're actually mating and meeting with wolves coming from the Balkans and the Carpathians. So you're getting this incredible reconnection between populations which have been separated for centuries. So today we estimate we have around kind of 17,000 wolves in Europe. And note that this is excluding Russia, Belarus, and kind of Ukraine. So this is really kind of in Europe itself. That actually is quite a lot of wolves, right? And virtually every population is actually doing fairly well. If we look at bears, so same story, 1950 on the left and 2013 or 16 on the right. And you don't see the same dramatic range expansion here, because bears kind of disperse much more slowly. They don't jump across the continent. They just sort of expand step by step. But certainly you can visually see that the distribution ranges have spread, populations have met, and certainly the density and the number of bears is increasing dramatically. So again, we probably have around 17,000 bears. In bears, you do have some very small kind of populations, the ones in the Pyrenees, the ones in the Alps, and for example, the bears in Abruzzo in central Italy are all quite small populations. Their trends are all stable to increasing, but we are dealing with small numbers there. So some populations are certainly deserving of very intensive conservation effort. But we have other populations like the Balkans or the Carpathians with 5, 6, 7,000 bears. And that is kind of really robust, strong populations. Looking at lynx, again, kind of same story. They were really hammered in Western Europe and Central Europe. In Scandinavia, they were pushed back into small parts. And today they're spreading much more. What is really interesting here, though, is that all of the lynx in Central Europe are the results of reintroductions. So for wolves and bears, the expansion has been natural. But for lynx in Central Europe, they have all been reintroduced. So we've actually had kind of lynx kind of reintroductions in up to 7 countries. I think it's probably well over 20 different kind of reintroductions now, and some are still going on today. Bears have been reintroduced into Austria, which failed. They have been released in the Pyrenees in France to reinforce the existing population, and they were reintroduced into northern Italy in the Alps. But wolves is entirely based around natural expansion. So, any of the kind of conspiracy theories about black helicopters and blue Volkswagens driving wolves around the place are simply that, only conspiracy theories in a European context. The question that comes into everyone's head, especially kind of foreigners, when they hear about these species which we tend to take as icons of wilderness. And then you start talking about recovery and expansion and tens of thousands of animals in Europe. They say, well, where do they live? Where is your wilderness? We say, well, we don't have any wilderness because wolves, especially, they don't need wilderness. They probably don't even like wilderness. Wilderness is a cold, dark, lonely place. Who wants to live out in the wilds when you can be a city slicker or at least live in farmland? So like this is a picture of classical Spanish wolf habitat in central Spain. And I don't know if you can see the mouse, but here in the middle are 3 little dots, which actually are wolves. So that's my best picture of a Spanish wolf. This is just like classic Spanish wolf habitat. And here you probably have, what, 2,500 wolves living in central and northern Spain. And they are expanding. So like Madrid is right on the frontier of wolf expansion. So you have wolf packs probably within a few kilometers of the edge of Madrid, living in what is essentially industrial farmland with incredibly low conflict. Other pictures, like Germany has had like a fairy tale expansion. Their first breeding in probably half a century was in 2000 with kind of 1 pack. And today they're actually well over 150 packs, which kind of corresponds to like 1,500 wolves. And they're living in a very industrial agricultural areas. But the main stepping stones for the expansion have been kind of military training areas and these areas of open cast coal mining. Because, nobody in their right mind goes and takes the recreation in an area with open cast coal mining or a military training area. So it's very kind of low disturbance, little poaching. And the wolves have used these totally trashed out habitats as little kind of refuges and stepping stones for their expansion all across Germany. There's a very kind of counterintuitive thing. But like nobody in the 90s would have said, that there was any chance that wolves would ever come back to Germany. And today, well, yes, they actually are back in Germany. And this German expansion has led to actually wolves breeding in Denmark and the Netherlands in recent years. And like that's the ultimate contrast to the wilderness kind of discourse, is the idea that wolves are reproducing in the Netherlands. But it happens. These animals surprise us. Again, some, wolf habitats and bear habitats. This is the Balkans. This is in Macedonia. And you can easily find bear tracks on the edge of this kind of village out there. And this is a landscape. It's kind of countryside. So people are farming, they're doing forestry, they're hunting, they're picking their berries and the mushrooms, and the carnivores are all around them. Final picture, like the Baltic States, which are probably quite like Ireland in a way in terms of being in the very rural landscapes with kind of fragmented forests and lots of small farms. And here you have wolves and bears and lynx. They're hunted in all the countries, but that hasn't ever been a problem for their kind of conservation, as long as the hunting has been kind of regulated. So again, it's one of these kind of slightly paradoxical pictures of what you would call successful conservation, that the animals are on that landscape, they're widely accepted, but hunting goes on at the same time. So I think these animals force us to confront many of the preconceived ideas as to what is actually necessary to conserve carnivores. And certainly the Yellowstone idea is not something that helps in terms of transferring, because then you think there's no hope, there's no possibility. If you have to be wilderness to have carnivores, and we don't have any wilderness, there is no hope. But that's not true. Carnivores really do not need wilderness. And just to step out of the European context for a second, it's not only Europe. India, for example, is a place where many species are actually expanding. So even though tigers, again, turn up as one of these things, they're actually going to extinction. Well, in some places they decline, but in many parts of India, tigers are expanding. And leopards especially have had an incredible expansion in recent years. For kind of several years, we had a field project on leopards in this landscape here. Totally agricultural landscape, no habitat at all, no wild prey, and up to 400 people per square kilometer. And the leopards were doing great. They had little tiny home ranges, really high densities. And if you look at that picture of the leopard on top, you see this guy is not starving. This is one big, solid, fat male leopard. And you think, well, what are these things kind of living on? And the answer is dogs. They really do well eating feral and free-ranging dogs. So, again, you don't need wilderness You don't even need prey. Well, you don't need habitat. You don't need prey to have a top predator. A landscape or sugarcane and lots of kind of free-ranging dogs is all you need to support one of the apex predators. If it's a good thing or a bad thing is a totally different question, but it does demonstrate what these animals can actually do. So kind of jumping back a bit to kind of Europe again, the question is, well, what has driven this kind of recovery? And it's certainly the result of 150 years of many things kind of coming together. So like the early improvements were the restoration of prey populations in the late 19th and early 20th century. This was almost entirely motivated by hunters who did an incredible job across the whole continent at getting the deer and the wild boar and like the chamois and the ibex and things back into that kind of landscape again. And then kind of forestry came back again in the 19th century and early 20th century, huge campaigns to reforest Europe for mainly strategic reasons, not so much linked to biodiversity, but simply just linked to the strategic value of having wood. And this created habitat and it created prey. And then from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, the legislation came in. You know, the protection of carnivores or the regulation on killing, the ban on poison, the taking away of bounties. And this has created the starting point for the carnivores to come back and take advantage of this recently created habitat with these newly established prey populations. And this was really the driver of things in the 70s and 80s. So kind of recently you have this additional thing of this kind of rural urban migration and land abandonment, which certainly doesn't hurt. But this is only the most recent thing on a process that's been going on for a long time. And I think its value is quite small compared to the earlier changes that kicked in 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So in other words, for kind of recovery, you often actually don't need to do much. Just let them do their thing works very well. Like kind of wolves, especially. Wolves are really good at being wolves, right? We don't need to help them. You know, we just let them do their thing and they do it well. And this works for lots of these bigger species, but not for all. So there is certainly a cautionary tale here that some species do need active help. Like, so Arctic foxes in Scandinavia were doing really badly, right? So like even though they were protected in 1930 already, by the time that we got to the 1990s, we were down to some 10 or 20 breeding Arctic foxes in the whole of Scandinavia. So like, what was it, 60, 70 years of kind of protection had not been enough. So doing nothing didn't help. So in the 2000s, there was a captive breeding program started, kind of bringing in some of the last surviving animals, which is highly controversial, breeding them in captivity, which is also kind of controversial. But after 20 years, it's obvious that this is really bearing fruit now, and that Arctic foxes have been re-established in many places, and the reintroduced animals are breeding, the offspring of the reintroduced animals are breeding, and it really seems that this sort of external input basically jump-started the whole kind of population again, so that they're actually suddenly able to begin to expand. So human intervention was definitely needed here. If we hadn't done this, they would have just slowly died out totally. Other species which really have needed help would be like the Iberian lynx, which are again down to some tens of individuals. They were captive bred in Spain and Portugal. And today they really have boomed back. So they have gone from being critically endangered to actually being endangered. And that was like viewed as a major conservation success. You know, and now today you have hundreds of Iberian lynx in the wild and they're expanding across Spain and Portugal. The European mink is again an example of a species that was doing awfully badly. I think only surviving in parts of Spain and France. So in Estonia, they started a captive breeding program and then a release onto some of the Baltic islands. And it seems tentatively like they are slowly starting to gain space again. But the problem is with the introduced American mink. So the question is how far these kind of European mink will actually ever be able to kind of recover. But at least at the moment, tentatively things are moving forward. So somewhat kind of paradoxically, actually, the bigger species tend to be better at taking care of themselves than the smaller ones. So we shouldn't be too complacent at times. But if we look at this kind of conservation kind of recovery, the question is, well, what has been the cost of this? Because our ancestors, they didn't actually introduce bounty systems and pay money and motivate the extermination without a reason. That some of these species, especially the bigger ones, are a problem. They are challenging to live with. And when we bring them back into the landscape, or when they naturally return to the landscape, we re-encounter all of these old conflicts coming up again. Like we have this eternal conflict with livestock depredation, where there are solutions to it. Our ancestors had measures to protect livestock. The challenge is to reintegrate these techniques into a modern economic framework, where shepherds don't want to work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year for basically subsistence. But people actually want to have a normal lifestyle in normal working hours with a normal standard of living. And all of these measures to protect livestock require extra cost, extra labor, extra input. And in some cases, it means turning the whole system onto its head totally. So it's not easy, but it can be done. In the north, we have the conflicts with the Sami and the domestic reindeer. And here is much harder. It really is difficult to find practical interventions which don't involve an awful lot of population control. And here you're entering into a conflict between what is recognized as being an indigenous people, and then nature conservation, which is always viewed as being something imposed from the outside. So you end up in a very complicated social context around this conflict. Hunters constantly have a perception of a problem. Sometimes it's a real problem, sometimes it's not. But certainly they feel it and they perceive it. And it's very difficult to prevent it, because carnivores coming back to the landscape, well, they're meant to eat wild prey. So even a question, can you actually view a wolf eating a moose as actually being a conflict? Because that actually is simply ecology, right? But I guess if you have an ownership feeling to that wildlife population, then you do perceive it as a conflict. The other aspect of the hunter conflict, which gets a lot of attention and emotions going in Scandinavia and also in Eastern Europe, is the killing of hunting dogs. And certainly when you bring wolves back into a landscape, hunting dogs are going to die. And in the past, this just happened quietly. The dog simply disappeared, and people said, okay, that's life. Some hunted dogs will always disappear. They drown, they fall off cliffs, get hit by cars, it happens. But with the advent of using GPS collars on hunting dogs now, you actually find them. And suddenly the dog disappearing isn't just disappeared, but actually you end up finding it looking like this. And this is certainly one of the most visceral and emotional elements of the wolf recovery, especially. And then this issue of the risk for human safety comes up again and again, right? We all know that bears are dangerous, right? It's not a surprise to anyone to hear that bears can injure and kill people. The question around wolves has been highly controversial over the years, but certainly our current understanding is that, well, yes, wolves also can kill people, and they do kill people. Rarely, tends to be only in special circumstances, but it does happen. So that we really have to view it pretty much in the same lens as bears, that normally it's okay. But yes, sometimes some things do go wrong, and we do need to be prepared to react when things start going wrong. But globally, this is like a much bigger issue with lions, tigers, and leopards. So some of our early work in India was focusing on man-eating leopards and trying to understand that issue. So there is certainly a a sticky, uncomfortable side of large carnivore conservation. There is a cost attached to it. But the main conflicts, and the ones which I think are much harder to deal with, are not the conflicts that you can see and touch and poke and that you get bloody hands with, but it's the conflicts which go on in people's heads. And that carnivores seem to be very instrumental at opening up the divisions between people. Like this is a topic I think all of us are used to now after Corona and Ukraine, is that we see these fake news and conspiracy theories and alternative realities emerging. Think about the whole Trump story and QAnon and stuff. And that you find a case, it can be Trump, it can be COVID vaccines, And these issues are what we call wedge issues, that they basically get driven into a crack in society and pushed down, driving different social dimensions apart. You have those who believe or don't believe. And wolves especially have been or become one of these kind of wedge issues in many issues. And they exploit many different divides, right? It can be kind of rural, urban, modern, traditional, it can be young and old, gender issues, occupation comes in, farmers and hunters versus others. And it can be highly political, really much aligned to whether you're left of center or right of center in your things. And wolves are simply can be used as a wedge to drive these kind of things apart. Often they can be very cynically kind of weaponized as a wedge in a wider social conflict. And these conflicts are very difficult to deal with. Like think about all the vaccine hesitancy issues. Think about the battle it's been to communicate this in a way that convinces people that vaccines are not an evil plot by Bill Gates to inject microchips into our body. You can put all the information, all the science out there, and you still do not bring people any closer together. And a big, scary carnivore with teeth and a very complicated past with all sorts of mythology attached to it is a very powerful wedge for exploiting these kind of divisions. This kind of cartoon sums it up in a way that that wolf in the middle is being a wolf, right? It's kind of Canis lupus. It weighs kind of 45 kilos. It has kind of litter size of 5 offspring. You have all of the biology, and you can agree on that. But different people in different situations will just view what this means in totally different ways. So you can agree on the wolf, but the meaning of the wolf is something totally different. Other issues linked to carnivores would be things like this, hunting. Is this viewed as sort of a successful picture of carnivore conservation, or is this viewed as a ban decades ago? It's a totally open question, right? How you view this. At least in a Scandinavian context, this might be viewed as kind of successful conservation. You try doing this in Britain, and certainly it would not be viewed that way. And certainly this issue about whether it's ethically acceptable or socially acceptable to kill charismatic animals is certainly one of these great kind of divisions between different publics, which is really difficult to navigate. A final division here, which I think is getting increasingly important, is simply the way that we talk about conservation. In my early career, I was very much talking about kind of wildlife management. That was kind of the framing, where obviously hunting and harvest and things were just all parts of the management system, but the goal was simply just to ensure that it could be sustained. But since then, many other framings of conservation have come, like conservation biology and rewilding, wilderness, and ecosystem services, and many other framings. And these framings are not just academic discussions, but they really represent fundamentally different, the appropriate relationship between people and nature. And just to really generalize, one of the major kind of divisions is whether you view people as being something that belongs as an interactive part of a landscape, or whether you view people as being a kind of a pollutant that is something negative in a landscape. So like a wildlife management framing accepts that people belong in the landscape, and of course they're going to interact with wildlife because it's a shared space and we have an interactive relationship. But you come in from a animal welfare or animal rights or a rewilding perspective and saying, well, people don't belong in a landscape. People are bad, animals are good. And you create this kind of separation. And it's very difficult to go up to a farmer whose family have been on the land for decades or centuries, especially like in countries like Ireland, where land ownership is something that was fought for over 1,000 years. And you tell them, you're bad. Your presence on this landscape is bad. We should rewild your farm, and we should take away the human agency from this landscape. That's not really going to open up a very productive discourse about whether you're accepting having kind of bats and pine martens living on his land. But if you go ahead and start talking about sustainability and kind of managing it, you have a totally different entry point into that conversation. So the way that we frame and think about conservation, I think, is probably the ultimate thing that will determine whether we succeed or fail in doing conservation in shared landscapes. So moving on to the final part here. Conflicts are something we understand really well. It's incredibly depressing sometimes talking about them and spending your whole life working with them, but we've got to a point where we really do understand them. Some can be fixed, some cannot be fixed. Some simply do kind of represent wicked problems that we're not going to escape from. But what I think is much more important is that we start talking about coexistence, because kind of conflicts are something that we don't want, right? We have them, they're real, we accept them, we work with them, but they're not what we want to achieve. We want to achieve this other state, this kind of coexistent state. And this word has really exploded onto the conservation scene in the last decade. The question is, what does this actually mean? You know, what does coexistence look like? You know, is it some type of nirvana where, you know, people and animals just hug each other and speak the same language? Or is it something else? And certainly I think our emerging view is that it is something else. That coexistence is not the absence of conflict, because there will always be conflicts. Coexistence is about constraining conflicts into tolerable kind of levels, and it's showing that we negotiate them in acceptable channels, that you don't go out and kill something illegally because you're pissed off, but actually you pick up the phone and call Ferdia and shout at him and try and influence it through some democratic channel, right? There are right ways and wrong ways of doing this. And generally, the calling Ferdia is the right thing to do in most cases. You know, he is your go-to guy in conflicts. It's his fate in life is to be the receiver of angry phone calls from people. That's what he's paid for. You know, he tells you he's out there trying to save the world, but really he's paid to take the phone and be shouted at. And it's can the coexistence is about accepting sharing space, right? Making some compromises, because compromises are crucial. Also being flexible and being tolerant are parts of this. And this kind of tolerance is not only like the tolerance of wildlife, but it's also the tolerance of other people who have maybe different perspectives on things and different values, and that we have to share space with people as well as sharing space with kind of wildlife. So this is like the summing up kind of state of the art three questions, right? Can wildlife live with us? And certainly kind of what we've seen is that most species are incredibly good at adapt to hide, something to eat, and do awfully well. Some of them need a bit more care, but in general, the big ones, especially like wolves, no, just leave them alone and they do great. The more important questions are, can we live with the wildlife? Are we willing to accept it? Having difficult neighbors who have big teeth and can be inconvenient, can cause can damage, and occasionally be a real risk to ourselves. Can we accept this? And finally, the question is, can we accept other people? Can, you know, hunters and farmers and conservationists and environmentalists, can they actually find a way to share the same landscape? I think this is actually probably the most important question of all. This is where I see the bottleneck emerging, especially as our kind of societies become more and more fragmented and polarized around every issue. Even things that you think wouldn't be an issue suddenly become an issue. That we have this incredible ability to create issues out of nothing. I think the Irish kind of pine marten story is kind of one of those ones. You know, kind of globally, you start talking about the Irish pine marten conflict, and people really look at you saying, "What?" You know, but it's real. You know, it's there. It's not any less real because it's a pine marten. It's just like one of the biggest carnivores you have in Ireland, and that's what gets focused on. It's expanded. It's returning. It's something different. People are not used to it, and of course, it becomes a magnet for conflict. Because again, the main issue of the conflicts is not the ones that you see and touch and measure. Now, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The real conflicts are the deeper issues, the social conflicts, and especially the political issues where somebody weaponizes a conflict for other gains. And when you think about it in those terms, then you actually don't even really need to have a real animal to create a conflict over it. You know, if somebody wanted to, I'm quite sure they could create a conflict around leprechauns. And you could easily have workshops on human leprechaun conflicts without any problem at all if somebody chose to kind of weaponize it. So that's kind of my end point here. it took a long time, but we still have some time for some questions before you guys get let loose on the coffee and the cakes. So thank you for your attention, and thank you very much for the invitation to be there.
John, that was brilliant. Thank you very much. Really appreciate you logging in from Norway. Really informative, but also I think quite thought-provoking, and certainly from a policy perspective, you've raised lots of issues that we need to go and think about. And we've talked about them before, but you're always coming up with new things as well. So I really appreciate that.
I forgot to put up your phone number so people.
I was just going to say thank you for not sharing my phone number. That was my next point. Yeah, don't call me. We do have rangers who, of course, are the first point of call for all conflicts. And we have, I know there's actually lots of new rangers in the National Parks and Wildlife Service, which is fantastic news. Some of them are probably in this room, but because we haven't met anyone for 2 years, I don't even recognize half the faces. But I'm sure we have some questions. Ruth is going to look after the questions that are online. And if there's any questions here in the room, just raise your hands and Kate will come and bring you a mic. But Ruth, do you have one to start with?
Yes, I have one ready to go. But first, thank you, John. That was superb. I loved every minute. And it's absolutely fascinating to look at the global context, because we are in our pine marten silo here, and it really was fascinating, and some brilliant comments coming in online and thanking you. But a question from Donna Mullen: our new draft biodiversity plan is being written at the moment and is being framed on the natural capital model. How would you advise on including troublesome animals?
Well, the good thing about kind of ecosystem services and natural capital and stuff is that it does put people into the picture, right? So it does view that people are a legitimate concern because it's a very anthropogenic framing of things. So it's not like this type of extreme kind of rewilding stuff that pushes people out of the picture. It almost goes the other way, in that it puts people too much in the center. And like when you start talking like what are the ecosystem services provided by a pine marten, there aren't any, right? They eat some mice. But the main thing is it's a cultural service. They're cute. They're fascinating, and that they belong there. They have a right to be there. But it's very difficult to put that into an accountant spreadsheet. So I think it's very difficult to get biodiversity as a whole into these accounting spreadsheets. And I don't think there's a single species in Ireland that you really need. You could take, well, perhaps some soil nematodes maybe, but otherwise, everything is something. It's because it's nice, and so I find these accounting things challenging. What we really have to do is just put the focus on these kind of cultural values, I think, and the ethical values and the aesthetics. And don't try to hide it. Don't try to create like, pine martens are regulating the carbon cycle and will save us from climate change. It's not going to make a difference, right? So I think honesty, just brutal honesty, and don't hide behind pseudoscience. Just say they're beautiful and they're cute and the world's a better place, wisdom, and just be open about it.
Excellent.
Brilliant.
Great. Are there any questions in the room? Everyone's very shy now because John's such an important international superstar. He's so intimidating.
That's me, Mr. Intimidation.
I have a question. Do you have time for one? I know you have another meeting to get to.
I can handle a few, yeah.
I was wondering, you mentioned that it was really interesting to hear about the doom and gloom, which isn't always accurate, and in many cases isn't accurate at all. And I wondered, do the IUCN classifications tell us in time if something is declining and give us enough notice as to reversing its fate? For example, you mentioned that we don't have the information on polar bears at the moment.
I think they pick up the broad picture, right? So, if you're really this sort of external kind of body looking, where should you make an investment? And you see pandas are doing badly, great, or Iberian lynx are critically endangered, then yes, you throw all the money in there. But it's because you focus on the critically endangered Iberian lynx in Spain. Well, if we're sitting here in, say, Norway, well, does that mean that we stop taking care of our bears because they're only vulnerable? Of course not. You still take care of what you have. So I think they have a very broad kind of global prioritization benefit, but we really need to operate and operationalize on a much more kind of local level, like pine martens. They're certainly not even anywhere on any threat list, right? It doesn't mean they don't deserve conservation attention in Ireland. So the IUCN list, yes, they give us a picture, but I think the national kind of red data books and red lists are much more important for operationalization. And then even beyond that, even some of the common species need intensive kind of management. Like I guess in an Irish context, deer, they're common as mud. And that's why they actually need kind of management attention and conservation focus. So I really think that these lists, they have some value, but you really have to operationalize things much more locally, I think, on other priorities. And being endangered is not the only criteria.
Yeah, great.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks, John. You raised the issue of wolves being very good at being wolves. I thought you made that very well. And I suppose there's been some conversations about wolves in Ireland, as you know. I think you've been dragged into them once or twice. And I suppose one of the first lines of defense has always been that we don't have the habitat for wolves, but it sounds like maybe we do have the habitat for wolves. So perhaps that's not the issue. Do you think Ireland is ready for wolves?
This is putting my little fingers into the hornet's nest here. Habitat-wise, sure. There's deer, there's some trees, there's gorse bushes they can hide under. They will do nicely, right? There's kind of quite a few roads around the place which are not so good, but and people drive like maniacs, and you drive on the wrong side of the road. But they will adapt to that too, right? So I don't think the people are ready now. Like if you look at the controversy around sea eagles, the protests at Kerry Airport, about these sea eagles, right? And then the trouble that the golden eagles are having, the red kites are controversial in some places. I really don't think people are ready yet for this. We aren't used to it in Ireland. We don't accept the risk. We don't accept the controversy. Land ownership is so important. I would certainly not prioritize it. I think there's many other places where Ireland can make a much more meaningful contribution to conservation for species which Ireland has a much more important role with. And having wolves in Ireland doesn't help because they're not going to be part of any wider metapopulation. They're stuck on an island, So I would not have prioritized it. I would have worked with low-hanging fruits, easier species, get some gains, and then look at the question again in 20 years' time or 50 years' time.
When we're both retired. Excellent.
Exactly.
I like the sound of that. John, look, I realize you're running late and you've been
I have to go.
off
I'm
too.
sorry.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you when you're over at Easter.
Definitely. Take care, guys.
Take care. Cheers. Thanks, John.